everyone. This is Rumela here from the 1947 Partition Archive. I hope you have had a great Friday. Please pardon us the delay in joining you all today. We had some technical difficulties. Today I am here to welcome you to the final day of the launch event series for the Tata Trusts Partition Archive University Research Access Points. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Rumela and I am Communications Manager of the Oral History Program at the 1947 Partition Archive. And today I am joining you from Kolkata, India. In case you are new to following us, the 1947 Partition Archive documents the nearly lost history of partition. Through our flagship oral history project, which is the largest of its kind in South Asia, with your help, we have documented almost 10,000 family stories. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website or speaking to any of our team members. You can also visit our online channels to find all the links and contents you need. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Kumar, who is our speaker for tonight. Hello, Dr. Kumar. She won't be able to join us on camera, but we would have her very much in the show. So let me start by introducing Dr. Kumar to everyone. Priya Kumar is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Delhi. Prior to this, she taught in the English department at the University of Iowa for many years as an associate professor and at the University of Virginia. She has been the recipient of a Rockefeller Fellowship at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and a Fulbright Fellowship. She has been working on partition literature and partition studies for many years now. Her first book, Limited Secularism, The Ethics of Coexistence in Indian Literature and Film, was published in 2008 and that examines the 1947 partition as a founding trauma of the Indian nation that persists in haunting subsequent generations. Currently, she is working on her second book called Exile, Strangers and the Stateless, Mass Displacement that emerged in the wake of the partitions of India and partition in Pakistan in 1947 and 1971. As a part of the second project, she has co-edited with Vika Kothari a special issue of the journal South Asia titled Partition and Sin, Dispersal, Memories and Diaspora, and published a number of essays on partition fiction in various journals and books. Dr. Kumar, we are so glad to have you for today's talk. Your work on partition is really fascinating. So can you get started by talking about it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rumila, and apologies about the camera to everyone. For some reason, it's not working for me, so you will have to bear with me in this online mode, and hopefully you can all hear me clearly. And thanks so much to the 1947 Partition Archive, to Rumila, Gunita, of course, and Anchal for helping to organize this talk, and it's a real honor for me. I was going to begin by talking about my earlier work on partition and then move into the current work. But in the interest of time, because things have been delayed a little bit, I'll just say very briefly that in my first book, Limiting Secularism, I examined the 1947 partition as a founding trauma for the Indian nationalist imagination. I argued that partition haunts and shadows the relationship between India and Pakistan, and that it crystallized the construction of Indian Muslims as strangers within the nation. Informed by Derrida's work on the idea of avowing the impossible and forgiving the impossible, I argued for the critical significance of returning to and avowing the impossible past of partition for the three successor nations of British India. And what I was trying to suggest in that book was that any effort to imagine a living together of peace and accord in the subcontinent must acknowledge, reflect, and work through this founding trauma of the Indian subcontinent. And this is especially important for subsequent generations who, while not physically present in 1947, have had their subjectivities shaped by memories of partition through familial, group, and national mythologies. And part of the task would be responsibility to unlearn some of these sanctioned familial and nationalist memories, which obviously work differently for each of the three post-partition nations. I can come back to this later, but I want to sort of dive right into my current work on partition and talk to you a little bit about that. I'm working on a book called Exiled Strangers and Stateless People, The Remains of South Asian Partitions. And I will talk to you briefly about that and just give you an overview. So in my current research, as is indicated by the title, I've shifted my emphasis to the mass migrations and the refugee diasporas that emerged in the wake of the two partitions of 1947 and 1971. And although a lot of recent work on the 1947 partition has focused on questions of violence and memories of violence, including my own, relatively little attention has been paid to the long-term social, psychological, cultural, and political impact of partitions displacements. And there is no doubt that both the 1947 and the 1971 partitions were traumatic events for millions of people in the subcontinent, especially those who were living in areas that were directly impacted by these divisions. So, like I said, there's relatively little attention has been paid to the long-term consequences of these displacements. This has to do with the assumption that partitions displaced were incorporated into the new national orders of India and Pakistan as citizens of their respective nation states. Taking displacement to be a process rather than a finished event, the meaning of which changes over time and over subsequent generations, I argue that the displacement sparked off by the two partitions must be understood as a still evolving process whose effects and long-term ramifications continue to haunt different regions and populations of the subcontinent, albeit in uneven and dispersed ways. And while most works on partition, including my own, have tended to highlight events in one particular region, the Punjab, and I did attend Professor Rajmohan Gandhi's very interesting talk the other night, and more recently Bengal as well. It is also important to underline that partition affected people living in different parts of the subcontinent in very different and specific ways, and not all regions were impacted to the same extent. I agree, therefore, with Willem van Schendel that the time has come to rescale the study of partition from the national to the regional scale, which is what I'm trying to do in my current work, and to consider its ongoing legacies in particular provinces, including Punjab, Sindh, UP, Bengal, Assam, Gujarat, and Bihar, which continue to unfold even today. Now, these after effects of the two partitions, or the remains of South Asian partitions, as I call them, include the ongoing ethnic conflict between natives within quotes and newcomers in different parts of South Asia, from Sindh to Assam, the construction of certain migrants as enduring strangers within specific regions, about which I'll have more to say, the self-fashioning of certain refugee and migrant populations as diasporas, the ongoing anxieties about identifying and demarcating illegal migrants from legal citizens, and finally, the reduction of unwanted migrants to a kind of human waste or disposable humans who must be removed to dumping sites or detention camps. In many ways, Edward Said's well-known essay, Reflections on Exile, served as an inspiration for this project, given that this is a project, given that I work on literature. And Said, he identifying exile as a central thematic preoccupation of much 20th century literature, he suggests that a whole genre of contemporary Western literature is a literature by and about exiles. But while exile may have become a redemptive motive in much contemporary literature, modern mass displacements and forced population movements, such as those that took place in 1947 and 71, are often excluded from the purview of what we think of as the literature of exile. So Said proposes that to concentrate on exile as a contemporary political punishment, you must therefore map territories of experience beyond those mapped by the literature of exile itself. You must therefore first set aside Joyce and Nabokov and think instead of the unaccountable masses for whom UN agencies have been created, who we tend to think of as faceless, nameless sort of herds or masses. So my project examines South Asian literature that portrays the predicament and travails of migrant communities and their descendants who were displaced by the pangs of state formation in 47 and 71. In particular, I focus on those migrant groups who were never really incorporated into the nationalist imaginaries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and who continue to be positioned as strangers, a form of human waste, or stateless refugees in their lands of arrival. In contrast to the self conscious valorization of the idioms of exile and hybridity that we encounter in the work of South Asian cosmopolitan writers such as Salman Rushdie and Jhumpa Lahiri, the novels and short stories I examine delineate the anguish and dilemmas of exilic, diasporic, or stateless existence within the South Asian region. And in today's talk, I will focus on one particular strand of my work, the issue of citizenship and the construction of partitions, migrants as strangers, even as they were granted formal legal citizenship, as well as the ways in which partitions' legacies continue to bear upon the citizenship claims of more recent unauthorized migrants, Hindus and Muslims who have crossed partitions' western or eastern border into India. Now, citizenship in India and Pakistan was forged in the crucible of partitions migrations and continues to bear the imprint of the 1947 partition, as a number of scholars like Neerja Jayal, Joya Chatterjee, and Anupama Roy have noted. Both India and Pakistan started with what's known as jus soli, or birthright citizenship, birth within the realm, as the basis of citizenship in their original sort of blueprints for citizenship. And both appear to have done so in response to the same concerns, to reassure their besieged minority populations and to prevent mass migrations. However, confronted with the specter of millions of refugees, the leaders of the two new partition nations were confronted with an unprecedented situation. The key challenge that was confronting the Indian Constituent Assembly, which is what I'm going to talk about, was determining the citizenship claims of displaced Hindus and Sikhs who had migrated in the millions from Pakistan. And the constitution took up the complex question of the citizenship of these people migrating between India and Pakistan in the aftermath of partition in Articles 6 and 7. Article 6 in particular was meant to deal with the citizenship claims of Hindu and Sikh refugees from what had become Pakistan. And it was, not surprisingly, a largely uncontroversial clause in the Constituent Assembly debates because of the immense sympathy generated by the refugees. Article 7, however, was a very contested clause about which we can talk more if later if there is time. But coming back to Article 6, it was a very uncontroversial clause because, as Van Schendel again points out, refugees crossing the newly drawn borders were constituted as proxy citizens who were coming home to their true nations after going through immense sacrifices. So their journey across the border and their arrival in Pakistan or India were constituted as a homecoming. And this idea of a homecoming is something I'm going to return to because it stays with us even today, as I will go on to talk about in my discussion of the most recent amendment to the Citizenship Amendment Act. So, according to the provisions of Article 6, those who came into India before July 19th, 1948, which is the day the influx from West Pakistan Control Ordinance came into force, they would be automatically granted citizenship. But those who entered after that day, but before the commencement of the constitution, would have to have stayed on for more than 6 months and to have registered themselves before the concerned authority. But more or less, the majority of people who came between those dates would be granted legal citizenship. But what I want to underline here is that while Hindus and Sikhs who had crossed the western border before July 1948 and the eastern border before December 31st, 1950, were granted the formal status, the legal status of citizens, they were often simultaneously constituted as strangers by local populations in various parts of the subcontinent. Now, to begin to talk about the concept of the stranger and its relevance for thinking about partitions migrants, we must begin by differentiating between the closely related concepts of the foreigner and the stranger in modern English. And this is something I've talked about in earlier work as well, but I think it's very relevant for talking about the partitions displaced. So in modern English, while a foreigner is clearly someone who comes from abroad and elsewhere and outside, the notion of the stranger allows for more ambivalence and ambiguity and the blurring of categories such as those between self and other, inside and outside. And in modern English, unlike in Middle English, the stranger is an unknown and unfamiliar person, someone who is other than one's own, ajnabi in Hindi, outside one's community, but not necessarily one who belongs to an other space, another city, locality, or above all, another nation state, which is typically how we understand the term foreigner today in modernity. Now, Zingben Bauman's work on the concept of the stranger is very helpful in allowing us to understand this concept and to distinguish it from the foreigner. He differentiates between two kinds of unfamiliars. The first are those who reside in practically remote lands and denote the limits of familiar territories. That would be foreigners, and exchange with them is outside the everyday web of interactions. The second type of unfamiliars are the strangers, and here I'm quoting from him, and he says, territorial and functional separation cease to suffice once the mere unfamiliar turns to be the stranger, aptly described by Simmel as the man who comes today and stays tomorrow. The stranger is indeed someone who refuses to stay in the faraway land or go away, and hence a priori defies the easy expedient of spatial or temporal segregation. The stranger comes into the life world and settles here. He made his way, or she made his way into the life world uninvited, thereby casting me on the receiving side of his initiative. So, a stranger is someone who comes into the life world uninvited and who refuses to go away. She or he may live in proximity to you, but at the same time is perceived as an unfamiliar, undecidable person. The unforgivable sin of late entry and the fact that the moment of entry can be pinpointed enables the production of the stranger as non-native, non-autochthonous, because she or he did not belong originally from the very beginning. And this is very relevant for understanding the ways in which partitions, migrants in different parts of the subcontinent to different degrees were constructed as strangers. The unforgivable sin of their belated arrival, as well as the different languages, dialects, cuisines, or religious practices of these migrants, enable their construction as strangers in their lands of arrival and resettlement, even though many of them became legal citizens of the two countries, whereas the older residents of India and Pakistan constituted themselves as the natives and the indigenes of those areas. So, indeed, the attitude of the resident populations towards the newcomers oscillated between hospitality and hostility to varying degrees depending on where they had migrated to. For example, serious differences came to the fore between the Assam government and New Delhi on the question of settling refugees, but Nehru dismissed these concerns as narrow-minded. And similarly, Pakistan's Minister for Refugees accused the Sindh Premier Kuhuro of provincialism when Kuhuro expressed reservations about Sindh's ability to accommodate as many refugees as demanded by the center. So many migrant groups increasingly felt unwelcome in their areas of resettlement, be it East Bengalis in Calcutta or Assam, Urdu-speaking Muhajirs in both wings of Pakistan, Sindhi Hindus in various parts of India, or Punjabis in Delhi and Lucknow. And later, of course, more indigent migrants who often belong to Dalit communities who came in from East Pakistan or Bangladesh into India were often treated with outright hostility and sent to faraway places like Danda Karanya in order to sort of quarantine or remove them from the body politic. So partition is deeply etched as, coming back to Saeed in some ways, as exile or banishment rather than a welcome or a homecoming in the memories and narratives of many survivors, as well as in many fictional narratives. By recalling and memorializing the 1947 partition as a form of exile, and by affirming enduring ties to cities, villages, or towns and people that live across the partition's borders, literary narratives like Kuritalin Haidar's Sita Haran, Intezar Hussein's Aage Samundar Hai, a more recent one like Reena Nanda's From Quetta to Delhi, Sunil Gangopadhyay's Arjun, amongst others, profoundly call into question the official homecoming narratives of Indian and Pakistani nationalisms. In Sita Haran, for example, Sita, the Sindhi Hindu protagonist, is figured as an exilic figure who's never able to find a place to call home after she's displaced from her beloved Sindh. With the passage of time, however, and over subsequent generations, this perception of living in displacement gradually waned for some migrant groups who were slowly accepted into their areas of resettlement, such as Punjabi and Sindhi Hindus who migrated to places like Punjab, Delhi, or Bombay, or East Bengalis who moved to Calcutta and its environs, especially if they belong to the upper castes. Wazira Fazila Zamindar calls this their successful incorporation into the national imaginaries of India and Pakistan, and she's talking particularly about the Punjabis. At the same time, we must recognize that this absorption often came at a tremendous cost to the new arrivals, namely the erosion or loss of the migrants' pre partition selves, as different scholars like Anjali Gera Roy, Nandita Bhavnani, and Rita Kothari have recorded in the case of Punjabi and Sindhi Hindus. The relinquishment of pre partition linguistic, culinary, and more fluid religious practices became the condition for their gradual acceptance by local populations because these practices were seen as inferior, uncivilized, and stigmatized by local populations. For example, Punjabi Hindus, unlike the Sikhs, accepted the hegemony of Hindi and the Devanagari script and acquiesced in the loss of a shared Punjabi linguistic and literary heritage, much like the Sindhi Hindus. Moreover, certain dialects of languages like Punjabi, like Derewali, Multani, Bhavalpuri, Lenda, that are today subsumed under the umbrella of Seraiki in Pakistan, have been almost completely lost over several generations in India. So, the cost of this process of assimilation has only now begun to be addressed by scholars in terms of a deferment of the process of mourning and as a form of de ethnicization rather than one of successful incorporation into the respective national imaginaries of India and Pakistan. At the same time, there are also other migrant groups, such as East Bengalis in Assam and Meghalaya, or Muhajirs in Pakistan and Urdu speakers in Bangladesh, who continue to be positioned as enduring strangers and permanent outsiders, indeed, often as foreigners or enemies who need to be expunged from the space of the nation. Novels by second generational writers like Kamila Shamsi and Siddhartha Deb illuminate how these groups have invented themselves as diasporas or groups living in perpetual displacement as a form of compensation for the stigmatization of being designated as perpetual outsiders marked by their Hindustani or East Pakistani Bangladeshi origins. These works clearly attest to the ongoing impact of partitions displacements even 70 years after the 1947 partition. Now, in my concluding section, I'm going to discuss the citizenship claims of more recent unauthorized migrants into India across partition's two fronts and suggest that the differential ways in which the Indian state has sought to deal with Hindu refugees and undocumented Muslim migrants, and the terminology is significant, attest to the enduring impact of the divisive legacies of partition on the construction of legal citizenship in India. It is worth asking how and when did the post partition Indian state's initial narratives of refugees coming home change to the overlapping discourses of infiltration and illegality across partition's eastern border? While the legal freezing of the western border happened soon after partition and the constitutional cutoff date of July 19th, 1948 was treated as final for Sikh and Hindu migrants from Pakistan to claim citizenship, the situation was more complex along the eastern border because migrations continued long after the deadline. And following the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, the cutoff date was effectively moved to December 31st, 1950 for the eastern border. And later, the Indira Mujib Pact declared 71 to be the official cutoff year for establishing the legality of cross-border migrations across this border. Still, the eastern border, as many of you know, remained porous even years after 71, especially during the Mujib years, and different Indian state actors and agencies continued to accommodate East Bengali migrants for an extended period by providing food subsidies and voting rights to them. And this was especially true of Assam. Many East Bengali migrants were given access to rights and benefits usually reserved for Indian citizens. As a result, the citizenship status of millions of migrants from East Pakistan, Bangladesh, including those who migrated before the 1947 partition, is marked by ambivalence and uncertainty even today. And it would be worthwhile to remember that many of the more recent migrants and post 71, post 80s are circular migrants who are fleeing from hunger, poverty, seasonal famines, and climate change in Bangladesh. But things changed with the onset of the Assam students' movement in the 1980s that targeted Bengalis in particular as outsiders, and which eventually led to the signing of the Assam Accord in 1958. And the 1986 amendment to the Citizenship Act gave legal manifestation to the Assam Accord and pertained to the thorny issue of delimiting and demarcating citizenship in Assam, along with the identification of illegal migrants in the state in order to eventually expunge them from the nation. This 86 amendment introduced a sixth category of citizenship by means of Article 6A, which was meant to apply exclusively to Assam. And the Accord and the amended Act, the 1986 Act, laid down various cutoff dates of entry so that all those who had migrated before 1966 from what is now Bangladesh were deemed Indian citizens, while those who migrated between 1906 and 71 and had been resident in Assam could stay in India so long as they registered as foreigners and their names were deleted from the electoral rolls. Finally, those who had entered the state after March 25th, 1971, was simply to be treated as aliens and deported upon identification. Now, this is a big change itself from the Citizenship Act of 1955, which provides that every person born in India would be a citizen of India. But with this amendment, those born after July 1st, 1987 could claim citizenship only if one of their parents was a citizen of India at the time of their birth. Now, subsequent amendments leading up to the 2019 amendment, the most recent one, have made these exclusions even more evident. The 2004 amendment, for example, restricted birthright or jus soli citizenship to those born in India only if both parents were citizens of India, or if one parent was a citizen and the other was not an illegal migrant. So even if you're born in India, you cannot be eligible for citizenship if one of your parents is an illegal migrant. So we can see how in recent years, Indian citizenship has moved increasingly to what Nirja Jayal calls a regime visibly marked by elements of jus sanguinis, with subsequent amendments to the Citizenship Act. And all of this emerged in response to increasing apprehensions about unauthorized migration from Bangladesh, particularly in the state of Assam. Now, very quickly, the most recent amendment to the CAA that was passed by Parliament in December 2019, along with the recently undertaken NRC exercise that was conducted in Assam to establish the legal status of people living in the state, led to widespread trepidation and protests in India just before the pandemic took over. The NRC exercise, even though it was done with the consensus of people in Assam, has raised many concerns about those who have been left out. As Sanjeev Barua writes, the NRC is an extension of this project that has grown out of the anxiety of the incompleteness of India as a normal nation state with normal immigration controls, especially across the partition's borders. What will happen to those whose names are not included in the NRC? We are new and unfamiliar territory here. And moreover, the proclaimed mission to extend the NRC to the rest of India does not augur well for Muslim residents of India in particular, especially with the passing of the CAB in December 2019, which muddies the NRC process in Assam, as many scholars have pointed out. And the 2019 CAB/CAA effectively introduces into Indian citizenship law a distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim immigrants by providing an accelerated pathway or fast track to Indian citizenship for religious minorities from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, everyone but Muslims who arrived in India illegally or stayed on illegally. The bill seeks to provide this fast track to citizenship for non-Muslim minorities from these countries on the grounds of religious persecution, and premised on the notion of India as a homeland for all Hindus, in continuation of the Indian nationalist narrative of partition as Hindu homecoming, as I tried to indicate earlier. So the CAA effectively incorporates into Indian citizenship laws, first, the notion that India is above all the land of Hindus, and that establishes Hindus as the core or organic nationals of India. And second, that each country is responsible for minorities in the other country. Again, something that goes back to the partition era and the establishment of the military evacuation organization. RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat has said, in fact, that no Hindu can be a foreigner in India. So the notion of Hindu homecoming and the protection of Hindu minorities in Pakistan and Bangladesh in particular are part of what I'm calling the remains of both partitions, as they bear upon citizenship in India and in Bangladesh. Indeed, the current regime's Union Minister of State for Parliamentary Affairs, Mr. Meghwal, wrote a piece in 2019 defending the still to be ratified CAB on the grounds precisely of partition's unfinished work. And he writes that the government has sought to provide what the Nehru Liaquat Pact could not so far, and that the proposed CAB is going to complete this unfinished agenda and become a boon for all the victims of partition, ending persecution of such minorities. More than 70 years after the partition, the Indian state continues to set itself up as a homeland for Hindus, in particular for those who find themselves on the wrong side of the partition's border, and as their protector or benefactor. At the same time, many of these more recent Hindu migrants from Pakistan, especially those who belong to Dalit and other backward castes, are stigmatized and treated as outsiders when they do migrate into India and overstay their visas. Many underscore the hostility of the resident populations in places like Rajasthan or Kutch, and the ways in which they are haunted by their Pakistani origins despite their shared Hindu identity. And one of them said, in Pakistan, they say we are Indians, Bharatiya, because we are Hindus. Here we are called Pakistanis, and all our actions are suspect. The specter of their outsider foreign origins and their links with Pakistan continue to shadow them. And so I'm going to sort of stop here. I could have talked more about this, but just to conclude, what I want to say is that clearly citizenship in India continues to bear the imprint of both the 1947 and the 1971 partition. Partitions remains continue to haunt our politics and our policies in more ways than one. And here again, I want to make a claim for the significance of literature, because literary narratives by writers such as Prafulla Roy, Molloy Konti Dev, N.S. Madhavan, Nina Sabnani, Farhana Ibrahim, amongst others, allow us to imagine the unique vulnerability and precarity of stateless people, and have much to teach us about the significance of citizenship, particularly for those who have been excluded from its benefits. And by portraying the precarious identity and the struggles for citizenship among different displaced peoples of South Asia, these literary narratives, I'm suggesting, direct us to the possibility of an ethical relationship with those who have been rendered outside the conditional circles of religious or ethnic group or nation. And in doing so, they urge a shift in our ethical and political imaginations, and invite us to reanimate and rethink the theory and practice of citizenship. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, for that wonderful presentation and for sharing all those facts related to partition and the articles and discussing largely about them. We have a question from one of our audience, Mr. Nanak Dev. He's asking, did Article 6 of the Constitution differentiate apply only to Hindus and Sikhs, or to everyone coming from Pakistan?
So I hope I can answer this, but what I'm trying to suggest here is that yes, Article 6 applied to Hindus and Sikhs, but when I talked about Article 7, that had to do with Muslims from India who had fled to Pakistan because they were fleeing from the violence, but who wanted to come back to their homes once the violence had subsided. So there was a huge debate in Parliament, in the Constituent Assembly, about whether they should be eligible for Indian citizenship or not, and whether they should be allowed to return or not. So that is why you had these two different articles, and it's very interesting in the Constituent Assembly debate, as Nirja Jayal points out. They were referred to, the Hindus and Sikhs were referred to as refugees, and in the debates, but not in the actual constitution. And Muslims were referred to as migrants, and something that stays with us even today, except that it's been used far more explicitly within the law. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, for answering that question. I have another question for you. So,
Yeah.
can you talk about your family history and what brought you to partition studies at a more personal level?
Um, yeah. Obviously, like many other partition scholars, people working on partition from different parts of the subcontinent, I too come from a family of partition migrants from both sides. Punjabi partition migrants. My mother's family was from Lahore, my father's from Lalpur, but both sides belong to Dera Ghazi Khan. And we all grew up with some awareness that our family's history and homes lie elsewhere in that other country, Pakistan. And of course, part of my work stems from this very personal, familial history of loss, displacement, struggle, and starting afresh in the new capital of the Indian Punjab, Chandigarh. But it also has to do with losses of a different kind that I try to talk briefly about in my talk, of language and more fluid religious traditions. So, as part of the post partition generations growing up in Chandigarh, I was equally comfortable in spoken Hindi and English, but I was not at home in Punjabi in the same way, even though it was all around me, because my generation of Punjabi Hindus consented to the process of Hindiization. Punjabi was viewed as a kind of crude and unsophisticated language relative to Hindi, something that urban, urbane, English-speaking Hindus shouldn't really use except in jest. Even though the Hindi, Hindustani we spoke was obviously inflected very strongly by Punjabi. I would also hear the remnants of another language used only by my grandmother, even though my parents could understand it, which was similar to Punjabi. And later I learned it was Derewali, a language that has been lost over subsequent post partition generations in India. And today, all I am left with is a smattering of Derewali words, and most of my generation are not even aware that we've undergone a loss of language or cuisine. And there's more to the story, but that should suffice for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, for answering that question. So now I request our audience to type in your questions if you have any into the comment boxes, and we will choose some to ask Dr. Kumar. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you love our oral history work and our mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO, and in some countries, donations are tax-free. And we have the links in the description to this video. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Kumar, once again for your insightful presentation. It was indeed a pleasure to have you among us tonight. And thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Romila. Thank you so much.